Todd, thank you so much for joining me here on the Open Minds podcast. I have so many questions for you about AI and deepfakes. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to ask you a clear definition for those that may be less familiar, the difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The difference is intentionality. Both relate to false information that gets shared and shown online, but the big difference is that with disinformation, there's an intention by the main actor or protagonist to share and to use that to deceive. Um, but it's in some ways it's a difference without a difference because once that main intentional actor shares that false information, then others share it without intention, right? So what is might be disinformation at the offset quickly becomes misinformation. And in the end of the day, we're just dealing with false information that's swirling around online.
And what does this mean for recent news events? We've got the U.S. election coming up in 2024, but how has this shaped previous U.S. elections in recent memory?
Um, it really is relate to recent memory. Uh, I think obviously the biggest thing on people's minds is on a lot of people's minds is the attack at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And that was caused by really the false notion, or at least the notion that has not been proven to any significant degree that the election was stolen from President Trump. Um, and so, because of that, because people's belief that that was the case, they undertook a lot of actions based on that belief, and some of that really resulted in the swarming of the U.S. Capitol by protesters, violent protesters.
Todd, in your research, you mentioned that uh, one of the interesting um, um, uh, methods we're seeing now is that people are gravitating towards misinformation and disinformation because of this massive mistrust or distrust of traditional media outlets and news. What have you seen has sparked along that mistrust and distrust of major news sources?
Well, there's a lot of things, and these things happen both on the left and the right. Disinformation is not a partisan issue in the sense that only one type of partisan actor disseminates those. Um, and you can think of a lot of examples, obviously from the January 6th, and Fox News just got in a little bit of legal trouble because they were sharing a lot of information in a lot of ways advocating for some of the false notions that led to January 6th. But these things happen on the left too. I think if the right will tell you that the Hunter Biden laptop story, which people thought was false at first, and it was and it wasn't false. That there's a disinformation angle in that. But there's in a lot of ways disinformation is has become an accusation in and of itself. If you follow Twitter for just the word disinformation, what you see is a lot of political actors attacking other political actors or people on the other side for sharing disinformation or that's disinformation, right? So it's become sort of a catch-all term, sort of like when Trump used the word fake news. I mean, there was fake news, there is news that's fake, but it was also a term used to malign real news that didn't quite fit with the narrative that some actors were trying to portray. So it's become a world in and of itself.
And in the world of disinformation, I've noticed this evolution as well. People share memes online and they still do, and memes, they're great for humor. But deep fakes now are something totally different. I wanted to first ask you about deep fakes. What makes them so unique, and how have they been able to catch on so quickly?
Well, I mean, what makes them unique is they're so believable, so they're so lifelike. They mimic reality. For much of history, we've relied on images, photography, video to tell us about the truth of certain events, from the Holocaust to the man on the moon to 9/11. Um, but in a lot of ways, what deep fakes and that type of content can do is it shares images that look absolutely real. If they're done well enough, and the technology is getting better, that many of these are done well enough, they look in the ways indistinguishable from reality.
And what does that do to the human psyche, Todd, when people see these deep fakes? Do they immediately start believing it? And how does that affect our human behavior as a result?
Well, it certainly messes with them, I'd say. Uh, believe it. I think a recent study by Rand showed, experimental studies suggested that a lot of people are believing this content. And that study was done before this huge wave of generative AI hit the street that allows us, with the click of a button, to create highly compelling images, um, highly compelling text that looks like someone wrote it, but it was a machine that wrote it. Um, uh, that's making a real big difference.
Todd, when it comes to the deep fakes, I find that catching them are really important. And sometimes when a deep fake pops up on a news feed, it's, watch this Steve Jobs, Joe Rogan podcast that never happened, but AI created. Um, and it's that catching, it's the labeling that it's a deep fake that pops up on our news feed. But I can imagine if that doesn't happen first, people then start believing the deep fake to be like, "Oh, I didn't know Steve Jobs and Joe Rogan recorded a podcast. I have it right here. I'll share it with my friends." So catching it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, we saw that with the really compelling images that showed Trump getting arrested and swarmed by police, going to get arraigned a few months ago, and it was put out as a joke. It was not intentional, not meant to fool anybody. But the guy created some really interesting pictures, and he wanted to share them, and a lot of people believe them. So yeah, without, I mean, I'd say even with the label, a lot of people will believe. Without the label, a lot more people will believe. And of course, it depends on what the content is. And the other variable is how smart we all get as Americans and world citizens, to get suckered in. But we're really at a time right now where we're really at risk for people believing things. The technology has not been disseminated very. It's been as far and wide as it needs to be for people to know that technology exists, and so we're really at a vulnerable point.
Todd, you mentioned content and how important, depending on what the content is, we may be more susceptible to believe it. Um, what have you found in your research that lends itself to believability when it comes to the type of content that's being created?
It's a really good question, and honestly, I've not seen research that goes into that. And in some ways, we see content that, for most people, would say doesn't look believable. I mean, going back to I think the Mid-Journey images of the Pope in his cool puffer jacket, right? I mean, I looked at that. That's got to be fake, right? But not everybody will buy into will believe that it's fake, and they'll buy into the reality of it. There's probably a lot of different variables at play, and I'm just shooting off the hip here. But one is how like savvy people are media wise. Some people are surely prone to believe in some of the stuff more so than others, and of course, how well known this technology is. And I think at some point you can imagine where there's just deep fakes everywhere, then people will be less likely to believe in this stuff. And then, of course, the content itself, does it look believable? Is it, to me, the puffer jacket didn't look real. But if you maybe showed an image of him doing something else, or maybe show an image of a cop putting their boot on someone's neck, an African American neck, well, that seems like, in theory, I could believe that. So I think it really depends on the content, and in those cases, people weren't trying to deceive. I think when people are really trying to use this to deceive, they'll probably be savvy about what images they create and disseminate.
Yeah, and it's playing on people's vulnerabilities, like you mentioned the a white police officer with its boot on a black person's neck. It's like exposing those vulnerabilities within society, exacerbating the rifts that already exist, can be very very divisive. And Todd, I wanted to ask you too about deep fakes because in your research you also talk about voice, text, images. Deep fakes is not just the Tom Cruise video or the Pope playing basketball. It can be Donald Trump being the voice for your audiobook. What are some of the downsides to voice manipulation in particular?
Um, I mean, we know back in 2019 that some business associate received a phone call from a CEO, ordering him to wire money to a supplier, and so the employee did that. That was a deep fake. voice, or at least the assumption is it was. There was also another case of a deep fake voice being used to steal money from banks in Dubai. So I think there's a theft angle to this. There's certainly a financial market risk to this that I think will probably get corrected because people are quickly realizing that that voice is not a true authenticator of an individual. My bank no longer requires a voice for password, so I think people are getting a little smarter on that, but still vulnerable. Um, the other angle of it too, I think, societal risks is if you, for example, a recording of President Trump, or of Trump or Biden in this upcoming election. Like before, these recordings were taken as gospel. Oh, they got a secret recording of somebody saying something nefarious. Now, look what we know now. I think we're going to have to be really careful about that in this upcoming election. And I think the military is going to be suffering from this as well. You can imagine a commander in Ukraine getting a phone call from his boss telling him to move troops or not move troops or to conduct an attack X or Y. That could easily be manipulated as well by the Russian side. So I think there's a lot of interesting applications on the voice.
Wow, Todd, that I didn't even think of the military perspective, and that's very fascinating. Um, because I can imagine that especially given that the internet, some of its early days were for military use, that it can be co-opted in that way for disinformation and to send commands that potentially could.
Yeah, and I'm sure that my guess is that the military, the radio systems that they use to communicate are not set up for this, right? So, yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting.
Todd, I want to shift our conversation to detection of or of deep fakes because I can imagine this is very challenging for Meta, for YouTube, for Google, because the algorithm is always, as I understand it looks for things that are shared, liked, commented on, pops up on your feed, and I can see a deep fake of name your politician being shared, being liked, being commented on, and that thwarts the algorithm. But how can these big companies detect some of these deep fakes before it starts kind of making its rounds across millions of people?
Yeah, well, there are detection capabilities. If you think, like for example, a deep fake video, where like the classic scenario is like a face swap video, right? Where you have an actor, like go to the Tom Cruise if anybody's seen the Tom Cruise videos, and if you haven't seen it, Google them. They're really good. The Tom Cruise deep fakes. You have basically in that case you have a Tom Cruise actor portraying Tom Cruise, and then they basically videographically swap the face onto Tom Cruise. Now, back in the day, you could detect that by abnormalities in the image. Um, but the technology is getting good enough that the images themselves, if the deepfake is done well, now that's a whole separate conversation. But if the deepfake is done well, then it's going to be hard to tell with your naked eye whether or not that is indeed a fake. So there are computer systems that do this, and in fact, these detectors are sort of part and parcel into the used in the creation of these. These are called generative adversarial networks that are creating these deepfakes. On the one side, think of these as two competing computer systems. On the one side, you have a generator that creates an image, and then you have a detector side, a discriminator that seeks to identify if that image looks fake or not. And if it does, how? And then it communicates that back to the generator, and the generator makes another run at improving the quality of the image. And this goes probably hundreds, thousands, maybe a million times over. I don't know exactly, but eventually, what you get is an accurate image. So these detectors exist. They can work to identify whether or not images are false. I think the fundamental problem is these detectors aren't very good, um, and they're particularly bad at new types and higher quality and new technology derived deepfakes. The Facebook did a competition a couple of years ago trying to identify or motivate people to create really good detectors. And so they created a competition for this, and they basically showed that if you have a brand new deepfake with the best, newest technology, the detectors can only detect those at about 65% of the time. Um, and that rate is going to get lower and lower as the quality of these deepfakes improve. in theory, to the point where the images become perfect or almost perfect, and then the detectors aren't so good.
That is, scary.
Yeah, the detectors are gonna say, and then the platforms, of course, have to use those detectors. And I don't know. I've not heard from Facebook or Google, or Twitter, but my guess is that, for example, Twitter is not running a deep fake detector on its platform that is scanning and evaluating every single video that gets passed millions and billions of times a day. So, um, uh, yeah, I don't think the platforms are set up to address this yet.
Todd, I wanted to circle back to generator adversarial networks, GANs, because for some, they may think that these deepfakes are being created by, you know, a guy who has a vendetta against Joe Biden in his basement, and is spending his time figuring out how to make these deepfake videos. But this is a very sophisticated interplay and network of, I'm assuming, groups of people to make these deep fakes work and mimic someone so realistically. Um, can you, for the audience, help unpack what a generator adversarial network is and how it functions, basically?
Well, I mean, I sort of gave the rundown. When you have these generators competing against discriminators and working to improve it, there's a whole process that are used to create these deepfake videos. And I should note that this is slightly different process than creating a synthetic video. Now, you have face swap videos where we can take Tom Cruise's image and put it on the face of the actor, and then you also have synthetic videos that I'll talk about it in a minute. The deep fake images right now, to create highly believable videos, you really need to do these face swapping videos right now. But there's a lot of effort that goes into it. One, you need a lot of training data that the generator can use to fine tune its development of images. So you're not going to get at this. You're not going to do this on your average Joe on the street, right? But President Biden, Trump, sure. There's plenty of videos out there for that. You need an actor who kind of can mimic the mannerisms of these individuals. So there takes a little skill there. It can take upwards of 2 months to create a high quality deep fake video, because after the GANs create the video and you have a video a video set. Now you need someone to go through each of those images one by one and fix little distortions that are still going to be popping up in the things. And then on top of that, the computer systems cost about 12K, or at least they did the last year. So it does take a bit of skill to create these. I think the challenge is that the technology is going to continue to improve and democratize this technology so that it gets a lot better. And the right now there's technology to create synthetic videos. You can do even synthetic generative videos where you can go. I think Facebook and Google have apps for this. You can go online. If you can get one of those accounts, you can go on there and do like a Snoopy rolling around in the hay with Lucy or something like that. And in theory, it would create something like that, but they are really not good yet. I mean, it's really obvious that they're fake. There's another type of synthetic video where you can go to synthesia.com. It's a website that allows you to create these videos, and they use this for technology to support like corporate training events. Right? You want to have a cheap actor do corporate training? You can go there and feed it a script, pick an avatar, and it will talk like a real person, and look like a real person. But even that technology is not so believable yet. And that technology isn't quite available for like to do major actors like Trump or Biden. But it's all going to be getting better over time. So this will soon be quite democratized.
Todd, we've talked about a little bit about some of the real risks with deep fakes. I wanted to ask you, as I was reading your research, about some of the potential benefits, but also the benefits with the caveat that are they really benefits? So again, Trump and Biden. We're just going to use. I'm just going to use those examples because they seem to be very much in the news. If Trump were to, or Biden were to, speak on a specific policy objective, and let's say they were sick that day and they lost their voice, couldn't their campaign create a deep fake video about their commitment to uh, the police, Black Lives Matter, diversity, equity, and inclusion, healthcare, environment, even though they physically may not be there and able to make a live event or a commercial or an ad read or what have you.
Not, it won't look very good, and I can't imagine them wanting to do that yet. Uh, but I mean, at some point, they yes, they will be able to do that. I mean, the future. There's a lot of positive examples if you think about how deepfakes can work in the future. I mean, think about the boy band. The band BTS, right? Like these are real people, and people swarm to watch them play. Now think of the next guy who can create an all avatar band um, that will never grow old. They're going to remain 17 years old forever. Um, you know, that person's going to make a lot of money if it's the right band, and people will probably watch their videos. And my guess is, I mean, I'm just totally shooting from the hip here, but my guess is that that will be really popular, and that will probably happen. We'll probably be seeing movies with actors with dead actors or actors at a much younger level than what they were when they were, and you know that would be all fine and well for entertainment. I'd probably watch those movies, and be quite. The technology is not there yet, but there's a lot of potential opportunity, you know, useful, interesting opportunities for this technology.
Todd, that's really fascinating. Can you imagine watching a James Dean movie? That would be something else.
Right?
I think the first step were some of these holograms that we started seeing with Tupac and Michael Jackson. Todd, in your research, you also mentioned the Hong Kong protests. It wasn't maybe your research in particular, but the Hong Kong protests and the anti vaccine movement during COVID-19 and how deepfakes were used during that moment. Um, can you, for those that may not know too much about that, how deepfakes exacerbated some of the divides that were happening around the anti-vax movement and what was going on?
Well, you know, I'm honestly not certain how deepfakes have divided the anti-vax movement. I'm not aware of any examples. But if you are, please do tell. Like I could easily miss it. Um, I do know that I will. So for what I will say is that we really have not. We've seen only limited use of this for political purposes. I mean, really, the biggest tool to fool audiences for political purposes are what we call cheap fakes, right? We just basically modify a video in Adobe or whatever app you have, and you can modify it in ways to either cut out content or include content, right? That's been available for a while. And we think of the example, classic example is Nancy Pelosi when some of her detractors created a video of her. Basically, they slowed down the speech and it sounded like she was drunk. But she only sounded like she was drunk if you really wanted her to be drunk. Um, and so audiences that wanted to believe that believed it. We've also seen the most recent, I think, examples that I'm aware of on the deep fake side from an adversary perspective are a couple things. One, um, Russia created a deep fake of Zelensky in the first couple months of the war. It was going back to our conversation about how long and how much effort you have to put in to create a really accurate deep fake. This was a deep fake that was done relatively quickly and sloppily, and it was quite obvious in the nature and view of the character that it was a fake. We've also seen China use avatars. They created a news program that they disseminated on YouTube using some of these fake avatars from Synthesia that looked like real people. But they fed it a script that was derogatory of the United States, and so that was a propaganda campaign that they used. Venezuela has also started to use Synthesia. And really, the value, I think, of using Synthesia right now is that you can just create videos with actors really cheaply. You're not going to fool anybody because none of these actors look like Biden. So you're not going to get Biden to say anything. But you can get an actor to say whatever you want, and that now all of a sudden you're saving money on the actors, and it's probably a good way to disseminate some false narratives.
Todd, I was recently reading a report by the spread of misinformation and disinformation in by the EU, and it was in response to what many Western nations are doing to curb that spread. And so here in Canada, the government has introduced and passed legislation. It's Bill C-11, which allows the government to push more Canadian-based content to your Netflix and YouTube, and other streaming services, Canadian cultural-based content. And a part of that whole debate were people wondering whether or not the government will have some type of say in the algorithm. But instead, the government doubled down, saying, "No, we're just pushing Canadian cultural content. We're not messing with the algorithm. If you don't want to interact with it, that's your business. But we'll just be pushing that content more. We'll be allowed to." But the EU's report mentioned that anytime governments kind of wade into the waters of what people can view and access, it runs sometimes counter to the freedoms of expression and the right to formulate opinions. I feel like the deep fakes, there's that murky gray area now, right? Because some people may want to interact with that content and believe whatever it is and share it and say, I can't believe Trump or Biden said this. Um, and does that curb their right to do that without labeling it a deep fake, if that makes sense?
This is a really interesting question. There has been and are a few laws on the books in the United States related to deep fakes. They're all at the state level. Texas, I think, has one that prohibits the use of deep fakes to muck with an election within like 2 weeks before the election. I think California has something similar, but I think that expired. There's also one in California that makes it illegal to create deepfake porn without somebody's express opinion or permission. But the question is whether or not these can stand up to for the United States. That's the First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. That certainly on the American side, we hold quite dear. And I think that's going to be an open constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I've read a couple of them, and they seem to suggest that's the case. That I think that's quite likely that some of these court laws will get tested in the courts.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a website where it'll just say like deepfake.com and you can see how great the technology is, but you're right, it could in fact shape public opinion as a result if it's not labeled appropriately, right? Like if there's not this big watermark saying that it's a deep fake, right?
Yeah, there's a huge risk of that.
I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned pornography, and in your research you talk about some pornography and some of the challenges with that. How has the deep fake movement shaped the pornography industry, and what are some of the risks with deep fakes in the pornography industry going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's energized it. I mean, anybody who wants to go online and look at pornography, they can, do so with their favorite actress or actor. Uh, uh, you can also there have also been websites where you can upload photos of people in their bathing suits or whatever, and then the deep fake technology basically undresses them. Yeah, I mean, this is obviously wrought with potential for not even potential. It's already happening of really attacking women and attacking their rights over their bodies. Um, and this could have political implications too. If you could imagine, this has certainly happened before, not necessarily deep fakes, but instances where women have spoken out about rights, or there have been women engaged in politics, and then a lot of innuendo gets sown, oftentimes by foreign adversaries. There's an assumption that Russia did this in Eastern Europe. Basically, sow rumors and show photographs of these women politicians engaging in sexual acts or whatever, and just the way mores are in society, that seems to denigrate the potential of women much more than men. And so it's used as a way of attacking women in politics. So I think that's also a major issue.
Todd, there are two main areas I wanted to talk before we end our conversation, and that is on behavior. So I know that some will take what they see at face value and say, well, it's some video floating around the internet, but that doesn't change my views on the Republicans or the Democrats or Trump or Biden or whatever. But there's others that will take that and say that one video tells me everything I need to know about that person, and I'm not going to like look at anything else. Do you think that those that take videos seriously, that shape their public opinion, um, are on the are the minority, perhaps more on the extremes, or are those slowly encroaching into some the public square, as I'd like to say, and dominating the discussion?
I feel like these videos will work if they meet somebody's schema, right? We all have schemas of how we view the world. And for those who didn't like Nancy Pelosi, that funny video that looked pretty fake was enough to reinforce their schema. And for them, even if they technically believed it or didn't, it worked with their schema, and so they cheered it on. My guess is you'll see the same thing on the deep fake side. We already live in this hyper polarized world. We all live in our own echo chambers right now. We don't even need deep fake content to drive us further into our echo chambers and further into our polarization and how we demonize others and lift up people who sound like ourselves. But we don't need the help, but we'll get it. And the deep fakes, I think, will play a role in that.
I'm so fascinated, and I know the research is still coming out, but I'd love to know if deep fakes have changed people's behavior as a result. Like, oh, I didn't know that about Biden. I might be more interested as a result of watching that video. Oh, it's a deep fake. Oh, okay, never mind. But I would be interested to know if there's actually those, instead of retrenching into their camps, they actually may agree with the other person on the basis of a deep fake video and start opening up their own political schema as a result.
Yeah, I think there's currently legislation out right now. I'll look at my notes here by Clark, a New York Democrat, on defending each and every person from false appearances by keeping exploitation subject to Accountability Act. Terrible name. But it does, I think, form a what is the? I'm not sure. Oh yeah, deep fake. That's the acronym. So that is something that legislates watermarking, and we haven't talked about that yet. You can basically create watermarks on these videos and images, and the watermarks are not something that you see. You're not. It's not like the report you see with the word draft embedded, embossed on it. These watermarks are at the pixel level of the images. Um, they're done in such a way that they can be read by computers. So it's the technology is available right now, and I think certainly probably in use on some levels to embed deep generative text images with these watermarks that make them computer readable. So I think that legislation is advocating for that. I think that without supporting one legislation piece or another, I think that idea is probably the right approach. There's also suggestions out there that you know. Well, obviously, the challenges with that type of legislation is that you'll have nefarious actors who won't do that. Um, and there'll certainly be foreign actors that won't have to be liable to these laws or be certainly be able to get away from them. But I think it would help. So, for example, if you required legislation, for example, that the major tech companies, OpenAI and others, that when they develop these, they watermark them, then that helps reduce the prevalence of the non-watermark stuff. The app stores can play a big role in this by only allowing apps, deep fake apps that include watermarks. And so there'll be huge financial incentive because you're not going to make any money on a technology if you can't app it. So that'll make huge incentive for folks to do to create apps, to create watermarks. And so I think that is at least a helpful approach.
And Todd, what would you say if you were at, let's say, a standing committee or a standing committee, and they called upon yourself to speak? What would you say are the top three major risks that governments, in particular, should be concerned about when it comes to deepfakes?
Elections is certainly one, but probably the other one is sort of interethnic conflict. We have our own sort of interethnic issues here in the United States, where African Americans are concerned about how they've been treated by law enforcement, and so you can imagine a video that that teases with that mindset. But other countries have it even worse than the United States. In places like India, for example, where Hindus and Muslims um, are really sort of at a very high level of tension right now, and where the education levels are a lot less than here in the United States, and many people there probably are certainly are not tracking this new technology movement. These videos could cause major problems in those areas, and you haven't needed these videos to create major ethnic strife issues before, but I think this will just add fuel to the fire.
Todd, I was actually going to ask you about that intersection there. It's about exacerbating interethnic conflicts and divides. Um, you know, you mentioned India. I mean, there's so many places around the world where that happens. The spreading of videos about, let's say, a Hindu group attacking a Muslim group or vice versa, does that uh, obviously fans the flames, but catching them a- and making sure that they're labeled as deep fakes could potentially help curb some of that violence, or do you think that regardless if it's labeled a deep fake or not, there's a direct correlation between that video and a violence increase?
Yeah, I think the labels would be really helpful. There's no, don't get me wrong. Labels will be really helpful, um, and so that is key. Um, would I think it would be helpful? Yes. Would it be helpful in places like India or Malaysia or other countries that suffer some of these things? Sure, absolutely. I think that would be helpful.
I think it also it's tragic that humans are sitting down trying to exacerbate some of these existing divides in our society for likes, follows, shares on social media platforms. That to me is a tragedy of the ease of this technology in terms of its sharing, not necessarily in terms of its development, but the sharing piece.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's again we go back to our disinfo conversation earlier. There's just disinformants who intentionally create this to deceive, but once it's out there, then it becomes misinformation quite quickly. So and shared quite unintentionally and oftentimes with good intentions, right? Look what's happening. And you haven't needed, going back to the Rohingya Muslims uh, in Burma, they you didn't need deep fakes. All you had to do is take a photograph of someone doing something bad and then label the person doing something bad as the Rohingya, and that was enough to really cause a lot of problems and a lot of deaths and a major refugee crisis. So it'll be interesting what happens with this technology. I will say that um, I when doing reading for my report, there were these terrible predictions about what would happen in the future, going back as far as 2017, 2018. They thought the 2018 election was going to get attacked by deepfake. That didn't happen. They thought the 2020 election was going to, and then they thought 2022. Right? We have not. We're really fearful right now about what could happen in the future, but these haven't happened yet on any significant degree, right? We have not. There's not been a major protest caused by deepfake yet, right? But we're worried it will happen. But there's a lot of assumptions that play into that. We're going to assume that nefarious actors are going to go out of their way to create these deepfakes when other simpler techniques are available. Um, we're worried that people will be so dumb that or uneducated or unsavvy that they'll automatically be fooled by these deepfakes, and we don't know that yet. And there's going to be a level of adjustment that society that experiences with this. That as we hear about President Trump's the images showing President Trump getting elected, like now, based on that, millions of people now know about this technology, and we'll probably suffer some problems early on. But my hope is that we adapt. And part of that adaptation, I think, will involve inherently having some level of mistrust toward anything shared online, or anything shared online for political purposes, right? But even still, people are going to share their family photos to friends and Instagram accounts. That's not going to be fake. The world, I don't know, it's going to be trouble. the world might not be as dystopian as we fear it will be.
Todd, I tend to agree with that because we live in this information superhighway. I remember that phrase so clearly when the internet started, the information superhighway. But I do have a lot of faith in the power of the majority, um, and calling things out. I just think as you were speaking, I was just thinking of my history class that I took way back in university days about the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and I remember. Um, them talking about how these diaries would come back to Spain, talking about how they conquered these savage Indians, and they were in need of the savior, and it built public opinion to say, well, they're on a noble mission to colonize and to save these people, and it was like there. I'm sure there were many dissenters saying that's not what they're doing, but it shaped public opinion for so long, and I just think that if there was the internet back then and there was a crowd of voices saying that's actually what's not happening there, um, that would actually challenge those narratives, because they were so seldom and people just relied on these seldom voices to speak on what was happening in the Americas. But because there's this power of majority with the internet and deepfakes would be called out and people would be like, I don't think Biden would say something like that. I don't think Trump would say something like that. I feel like there's a lot of people would call it out immediately and perhaps even like report as abusive content or something on these platforms as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point.
Todd, we've covered a lot here when it comes to deepfakes. I can't thank you enough for your research and shedding light on this really important subject. I'm like you, I'm hopeful for the future, but regardless, I think governments, people, and companies and public figures just need to know that this tech does exist, and we have to kind of start thinking about both the pros and the cons, mostly the cons, of how it can be used to shape public opinion.
Yeah, totally agree. I thank you for covering this topic. I think this will certainly help move the ball forward and getting more and more people educated on this.
Thanks so much, Todd. I appreciate it. All right. No problem. Bye bye.